Hello and welcome to a new Mendix Expert Developer webinar. My name is An Lee and I will be your host for today. Today's webinar will be about taking a deep dive into XPath and will be presented by Daniela Field, our Senior Solutions Consultant at Mendix. During the webinar, you could submit your questions in the question window in GoToWebinar. After the presentation, we will go through them one by one. The questions and answers will be added to the webinar page afterwards. Before we start, please look at the handouts window in GoToWebinar to find the presentation slides. Thank you for joining and enjoy the presentation. I will now give the floor to Daniela.
Hello everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying their Thursday morning. So today's topic and agenda is to talk about what XPaths are. We'll cover the XPath syntax, the basics, and then we'll provide a couple of examples on how to best implement XPath constraints. And we'll also talk about best practices when adding them. So what is an XPath constraint? XPath is basically the primary query language. OQL is a secondary query language that gets converted into a SQL query. The query is based on your hierarchical structures. So it's completely based on how you have structured your domain model, what the relationships are, and so on. And obviously, what is a query? A query is basically a command to receive a specific subset of data. So where can you use XPath? You can use XPath to constrain on context. So for example, you are in a data grid and you only want to show a specific subset of that data. You can add constraints on selectable objects. For example, when you have a reference selector and you want to constrain it based on either another reference or on a specific subset. And of course, when you're using microflows, you can constrain the data when you're doing retrieves to make sure that you're getting the desired subset of data. Another place where you can add XPath constraints is on the security of the entities. For example, if you are an agent, you might want to log in into your application and only be able to see your own environment and your own data. Or let's say that you are a financial advisor and you only want to be able to see your customers, your own customer data and not other people's. So that's another example where you need to actually add constraints. And the way that you can do that is through an XPath constraint. So let's look at the following domain model. So we have a course, and that course can be scheduled multiple times. And that scheduled course can have multiple registrations. Let's say that we are on the registration list of objects, and we want to retrieve, for example, all the registrations where the course is an advanced course. The way that we can do that is we start off with the context of the page, which is the registration. And notice that the training registration is all underneath the hood, so you don't need to worry about what the context of the page is. You specified when you select the entity that you want to show. To get from the registration to the course, we need to go through the relationship, so from the registration to the scheduled course, within the scheduled course entity, and then from the scheduled course entity, we need to go through the relationship again to get to the course entity. But of course, we're not done yet because we only want the courses where the title is advanced course. So we have to go one more in-depth layer to get the title where the title is advanced course. So it looks a little bit intimidating, a lot of slashes and dashes and dots and underscores. So what does it all mean? Well, let's review the syntax. So the forward slashes, you will never see this. This is basically the context of your XPath query. So in this example, you're either retrieving the course or you're showing the course on a page. And again, this is all managed underneath the hood by the platform. When you want to start to add an XPath constraint, you would start by adding brackets. So brackets are very helpful in order to group XPath. And you can have multiple brackets. Obviously, if you're opening a bracket, you want to make sure that you're closing it as well. The dot is used to separate the module from its elements. So, for example, the training is the module you're in, and the course is basically the entity you're in. And then the / is used to separate domain model elements. So, for example, in here we are separating the course from the title. So it's the course entity to the title. And then you have a lot of built-in flexibility and functions. So, for example, this is a not function, and you can use parentheses to use those functions. So you can do retrievals based on, for example, all the trainees where the name is Janssen, or all the entities, so you can add entities, again with the same constraint. Or let's say you are in the registration and you want to go through the relationship to grab the trainee with the name of Janssen. Or if you are within a microflow, you can create variables that are predefined within the context of that microflow and use those variables to form XPath constraints. There is a whole plethora of other XPath operations. You can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, not equals to, or, ands, empties. For example, you want all the people where the registration trainee's first name is empty and their grades is less than 5 or greater than or equal to 7. So you can do a lot of complex queries with XPath. So here is an example. So we're retrieving all the trainees from the database. Well, if we're doing that, then we're just going to retrieve pretty much all the trainees. There's no XPath query added in. If we do a restriction on first name of Tom, it's going to restrict it based on Tom specifically. So it's not going to return Thomas or any other other people. Now, if we are again on the trainee, so that's the context of the page or managed underneath the hood, and we want to retrieve all the registrations where the discount is greater than 30, we have to go through the relationship of the registration to trainee to the registration entity down to the discount that is greater than 30. Let's say that we want to do a retrieval of the discount being less than 30 or greater than or equal to 50. Again, you can go through the relationship to get all that constraints. So let's do a simple example. We see a list here of scheduled courses, and we can see that all of them, like in progress, finalized, or incomplete, all of those dashboards are basically the same. So let's add an XPath constraint where we want to specify what the course status should be. The way that we can do that is we go to our scheduled course overview, which is the page that we're seeing, and when we go into the data grid, which is again the under the hood context, we can start by opening up a bracket, and notice here how the minute I add a bracket, you'll see a lot of options for that specific XPath constraint. So you'll see all the options. You'll see like the current date. You can see current date time. You can add quite a lot of flexibility here. So what we're going to do is add the course status. So we can do the course. So that we want the course status to be equal to scheduled. So if you don't know what the specific thing is, you can also do Control spacebar, and that will give you all of your options. So in this instance, we want the scheduled status. So the shortcut with XPath that I find very helpful is basically control spacebar. So we have basically all the scheduled courses that are scheduled. On the second tab, we might want to add all the scheduled courses that are in progress. So let's do course status is equal to in progress. And you can continue on doing the same with all the other tabs. But let's just deploy and see what that looks like. Let's go to the schedule. So notice how previously it was 104. Now we have it narrowed down to 85. And there's only 2 scheduled courses that are in progress, for example. So let's continue on. That's just a simple, obviously, example, and I'm sure that you're all looking forward to seeing actually more complicated XPaths. So here's another example. Let's say that we want to show, for example, registrations where the trainee did not attend, or where the trainee did not attend and there was a discount smaller than 50, or a trainee or no registration has no registration of scheduled courses, or the trainee has a professional level attended and the discount was bigger than 50%. So these all seem fairly complex queries, and it really helps when you're creating more complicated queries to actually look at the domain model. So in this domain model, we have one scheduled course with multiple registrations, and one trainee can have multiple registrations. So it helps to be more aware of the domain model so that you know what that hierarchy is, and you're able to actually build that dashboard. So let's go to our XPath basic dashboard. So we want basically all the unattended registrations. So if we go to the data source, within the registration there is an attended Boolean value to see if a trainee attended or not. So we want people who did not attend. So all we have to do is just say attended equals false. And notice the nice thing here is that you'll see like if there is any mismatched input-output or any other problems with your XPath constraint. So it's very nice because it tells you when you need to open and close the brackets. So voila, that was pretty straightforward. But let's say that now we are on the scheduled course and we want people who did not attend and the discount was greater than 50. So from the scheduled course, we need to go to the registrations. So we start again with the bracket, and I just typed in R for registration and it automatically limited my options. So now we're going from the scheduled course to the registration, into the registration entity, and we want the attended, which is equal to false. And the next thing that we want is, again, we're starting with the same path, and we want the registration where the discount is less than 50. So as you're starting to write XPath queries, you'll find yourself writing all the paths out, and that is okay to like get practice and also to become more comfortable with the underlying database. Another way to write this query is also by actually, if you notice, you don't really need to go over the relationship twice. What you could do is you can just group it with attended and the discount of 50. So this is a much better way of writing XPath constraints. So notice that you are within the registration, and in there you want to grab the attended, unattended people, and also the discount of less than 50. So instead of going over the relationship twice, you can actually start grouping the XPaths. And this is a very key thing because it allows you to have a better performance application, and also your XPaths actually look cleaner and better. So other people can go in and troubleshoot them. So again, we're on the scheduled course and no registration, and the registration is attended equals false. So what we can do is there is an attribute called number of registrations on the scheduled course. So we want the number of registrations is 0, or, so again this is an or function, the registration we're going down to the attended again is equal to false. And close bracket. So let me open that up so you see what that looks like. So we want the number of registrations is equal to 0, or the registrations attended is equal to false. And again, to go to the registration, we have to go through the relationship into the entity, into the attribute to get to the false. Here's another one where we have attended and the trainee level is professional, and there's a discount of 50 or more. So what we can do is, let's make this bigger so everyone can see. So we have to go to registration. Well, first of all, make sure you're opening the bracket. Registration attended equals false. True. And we want basically a discount. So remember, with the shortcut that I showed you before, we can actually start a bracket. And now we are within the registration entity. And the discount, so I can do control spacebar, is greater than 50. And we want the trainee. So you can start typing the T and do control spacebar. We want the trainee. We want their level. So notice it shows you like all the particular attributes that are related to that trainee. So we want the level to be, again, I love the shortcut of control spacebar. We want their level to be professional. So notice again how it's so helpful to actually have the platform tell you when you're not actually closing or opening the brackets. So it tells you exactly when you have matching or non-matching. All right, so that was pretty straightforward. So again, it's very helpful to actually organize it clearly, maybe even have it in a more syntactical, more syntactically readable and easier to read. Okay, so there is a whole other number of constraint functions. So for example, you can check customer IDs, you can use contains, you can use starts with, ends with, not functions, true or false, length, datetime functions. So for example, the contains function AN will return Janssen and Tomen and the whole other numbers that have the AN in them. Or the last query, for example, the ID equals to current user, it will retrieve, for example, the user that is currently online. There's also system variables that could be object related, like the current object or the current user. You can also use user role related system variables. So for example, the user role is administrator. There's of course date time related, so current date time, beginning of current day, day length, and so on. And as you can see, for example, you can also do calculations like subtractions, multiplication, and so on. So in this example, again, we have the trainee where the first name is not Tom, so it returns pretty much everyone who doesn't match with the name Tom. And that is the same as not equal to Tom. Whereas the second example, where like the trainee's discount is not 30, is not the same as the discount not equal to 30. Because this function, all of it needs to work. For example, if there is no registration, it will return that object. So you need to be mindful of how you're using those functions and make sure that you're testing your data appropriately. You can also have contains functions. So for example, notice how both Tom and Thomas are being returned in this query because they both contain the letters Tom. And you can also do calculations like, for example, the date of birth is less than the current time minus 15 times however the year length is. And in this example, you're returning all the registrations of the current user who is logged into the system. So for example, as a trainee, I only want to see my registrations. That's a security feature that you might want to add. So in terms of best practices with XPath, it's really critical to, or helpful to, add the most constraining query first. So for example, if you have tasks and some are active and a due date, you might want to switch that to starting with the date being in the future, and then all the ones that are active equals true. Because by putting the most restrictive query first, you are already eliminating pretty much all the other previous tasks. And as I mentioned, best practices, it's always a good idea to optimize the XPath. One, for readability. It's much easier to read the second query versus the first one. And two, obviously for performance. You don't have to go through the relationship like twice to get the discounts. Other best practices, be mindful of when you're using or not functions. Because that's left outer join SQL queries. So there could be some performance reductions. So in this example, you're doing a query of scheduled courses where the course duration is greater than 1 day and the location is active. So instead, or the location is active. So instead of writing one very complicated long query, it's actually much better to use list operations. So for example, query the first where the duration is greater than 1, and then the next one where the location is active, and do a union of the two to get the OR statement. So whenever you have pages where you're using XPath constraints, you have, well, there's XPath queries that are generated based on the connected entity, the sort parameters, whatever search fields you've added, any additional XPath constraints, for example, security or any other XPaths. So basically, there is a retrieve list action that happens on the Mendix business server that with a generated XPath, and it retrieves the schema, and it specifies like which attributes are required. So this is what happens on, for example, a retrieve list action. So from the client, you're querying a retrieve list, which gets converted into a SQL query into the database, and then the database gives that back into the Mendix business server or the application server, and that returns it back to the client. So here's an example of you are within the customer page and you want all the customers where the name is Tom. The schema is basically on that page you're only seeing the name of the customer and the city where they're from. That gets converted into an OQL query and then from an OQL into SQL. And you can see that as the queries become more and more complicated, the select statements become more complicated as well. So it's very important to optimize those queries as you're building the pages. Another thing to be mindful of is that each reference selector triggers its own retrieve list action. So for example, if you're on the scheduled course and you're retrieving the course title, that is a query to grab the course. So if you have 10 courses, that's fine, but if you have thousands of courses, which a lot of universities or environments have, then for usability purpose as well as performance, it's much better to actually use a pop-up page where the users will be able to actually select and filter much more easily versus actually like scrolling through thousands of records to figure out the course that they want. There's also a lot of other cool widgets online where you can, on the App Store, where you can do other faster, better retrieves. So it's a good idea to avoid editable like reference selectors because they could show a lot of records and the user will have a harder time scrolling through thousands of records to figure out the one that they want. So you can easily replace those with a pop-up. Another example is, again, as I mentioned, each reference selector has its own retrieve list. So in this example, the title, the description, duration, and the price of the course, those are all reference selector queries, and you're doing it your own retrieve list action. So it's much better to actually, if you're displaying multiple attributes of the same associated object, to use a nested data view within that object. So just retrieve the whole object, one query versus 4 different separate queries. Another really great feature on the selectable objects is you can do other XPath constraints. So the XPath constraint will be added to the database query when you call the page or when you open a page. Whereas the constraint by feature will actually act on changes that are tied to other reference selectors. So a very easy example of the constraint by is, let's say that you are a customer and you're trying to insure your car. If you log in to, or if you just type in the name of your car, the type of your car, let's say it's a Toyota. If you select Toyota, you're going to see Venza, Corolla, and other options. If you change it to a Porsche or a Mercedes-Benz, you're going to see other car options. So it dynamically changes based on the car type. So you can add other XPath queries, but if you're adding XPath queries on the pages, be mindful that this is more for usability and not for security. So for example, if you don't want a trainer to see other scheduled courses, you want to add that constraint not on the page, but on the entities themselves. So best practices, you want to avoid having a lot of editable reference selectors. You should either use a wizard or a lookup page. And also, if you're showing multiple attributes of the same associated object in a nested data view, wow, that's a mouthful. You also want to avoid pages where you have 5 queries. And again, think of each reference selector as a query, so you want to be mindful of that. And make sure that your page constraints deal with usability and security. So here's an example. If we are on the scheduled course new edit page, notice here how I'm querying the course title at least 4 times. Instead, what I can do, I can add a widget, which is a data view. And based on my, so I'm within a nested data view. So I'm going to select the course entity and say OK. I love using the automatically fill in the content because it'll automatically pull in all the data that I need. And of course, I can easily go back and just delete all the components that I do not want. So in this example, we have the title, the description, and the duration. So what I can do is I can easily go in and delete all of these. I can do other features. For example, I can make it non-editable. Maybe I might want to switch the description from a input parameter from an input line to a text box area. So that you can actually read the description. That's easily done as well. And this whole process, again, is just taking a couple of seconds. So if we go down on this particular page, let's say that I have here the location. Notice how you have the arrow pop up. So that shows you that you already have a selected page for the location. So if you have like worldwide locations, you might only want to see a specific part of those locations. So it's fairly easy and straightforward to add a pop-up. All you have to do is right-click and do Generate Select Page, and that page will automatically be generated for you. Now, on the trainer, let's say that we want to restrict the trainer through the relationship to location. So for example, you only want to see trainers that are on that specific location. What you can do is, notice here the selectable objects. You can add any kind of constraint and any other kind of restrictions based on specific features. So if we double click on the trainer, you can see here all the various constraints. So you can add constraints like, for example, on a specific attribute, on a name, and so on. All right. Another example of when you could add restriction is, let's say, for example, on your domain model, we have a trainer and a trainee. Let's say that you want the trainer to only see the trainees for whom they are a coach for. The way that you can add the restriction is go into the trainee. Within the access rules for the trainer object or for the trainer user role, a module role, you want to add an XPath constraint. So you want basically the trainer to be able to only train the people for which they are a coach for. So you want the relationship between the trainee coach to be equal to the current user. So only if that relationship has been set will you be able to see other people that you are a trainer or trainee for. And again, it's always a good idea to add XPath constraints on the domain level versus actually adding it on a page, because if you have like 10 pages and on one of them you forgot to add the security, other people will be able to view information. So with that being said, let us open up for questions. So is there any, there's a question here, is there any performance difference between having multiple groupings or combining them into one? And if they're separate, does the order matter? So the order does matter. It is best to actually add the most restrictive query first and then the other. So it's always a good idea to restrain by the most constrictive and then add the other ones. Another question, how long can a query be? So queries can be quite long and complicated, but you want to think about how to express them as simply as possible. So there is really no limit. It's based upon how your entities are related and associated. So it's based upon your domain model, and there is no limit on how long the query can be. With that being said, just because you can build a very complicated query, it doesn't mean that you should. So another question is, can we see the resulting SQL query to optimize it for performance? Yes, you can. So what you can do is, when you're running the application locally, you can actually set different log levels. So for example, on your retrieve or on the queries, you can set it to either trace or debug. And that will actually show you what the retrieve and what the SQL queries are as you're going to that specific page or as you're going to that specific microflow. If you want to see this live on an actual real application, you will need to obviously set the log levels on the acceptance environment to be what you need it to. So let's see what other questions are there. Can you use XPath in reports as well? So that is a great question. You can do query on reports when you're doing, let's say, charts or other things. And you can also add XPath when you are using a complicated microflow to power up those reports. So that is another example. So another question is, if you're showing an attribute by association, is that a query on its own, or is there a performance impact? So the attribute is being shown through the relationship. So if you're using a selector, reference selector, that is a query on its own. Another question is, should you constrain on an index attribute before an unindexed one? That is a great question. So you should do that first. Another question is, why can't you have an XPath constraint on a numeration dropdown on a page? So a numeration dropdown, that is a fixed list. So it's not being based upon on a relationship to another entity. So it's basically fixed data or static data. There is another question, if a query can ever be too long. Again, for that query, you want to, the queries can be long, and if they have to, that's okay. You just need to make sure that you're optimizing it. For example, instead of writing out the full path on the discount example, you don't want to write it all out. You might want to think about how to optimize it as best as possible.
That's it for today, guys. Don't forget to leave your feedback on the way out. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.